Hello, today we're here with poet, translator, and songwriter Steve Reese, who's going to read his translation for Sign and Breath. Thank you, Steve. Welcome.
Thanks, Phil. Happy to be here. Beautiful morning. Um, this is a poem by the Cuban poet Roberto Manzano, and I've translated the title as Grateful Now. Here's how it goes. The contents of the day turned out on their stretch of ground. What do you see where you? Not the trail of green fragments, the eyes of fish, not the statue's curves in the air. You don't hear a silence, a stubborn din. When the turning green volume of the trees closes overhead, within are the seeds and then fruit. It happens, it's living. And below sometimes is a child cracking almonds, and the dry, sweet smell of childhood rises. And outside, under the sun, a bloodlines, sweaty blouses and shirts swelling with place and voice. Record them with eyes time has sharpened, wave on wave, weaving your footsteps. And you are only that, a living mound, a restless mass. And each twig that sounded made you a low shrub, then tree. From where will you come if you don't come from another, others, everything? Be grateful now, it is time, and put together the planks as they suit your subjects. In the luminous space, gather the stones of your simple monument. For what do you pass when you pass? Hectic and inexorable, you go by, and you live only when you add your waters to the rivers.
Beautiful, Steve, from Synergos, selected poems that you translated so beautifully. We're talking about voice, Steve. Obviously, with the translator, there's even more complexity because there's the translator's voice and then the poet's voice that you have to somehow intuit and render. Tell us about that process.
Well, I think it can be, from one angle, daunting. I mean, I think it can be a source of frustration. I mean, Shelley's famous for saying Shelley, who translated all the time, saying how impossible translation is because of the way in which the sound of language contributes to meaning. But the problem, if you want to look at it as a problem, is much larger than that. Because I think one of the things this poem says, I mean, it brings up the word voice, is that the sources of voice are everywhere, are multiple. They come from place, they come from history, they come from others around you, they come from lineage, they come from so many sources. So when you factor that in, then to translate voice in the sense that your book is using that word into the voice of another language seems really impossible. But of course, I think a lot of translators, I'm one of them, see this as an invitation or an enticement because really you're entering into, in trying to bring that voice over with some measure of authenticity, fidelity, you're entering into that complex web of associations, forces, sources, as best you can. And for a translator, that's enormously exciting. I mean, it's for me to start translating Manzano's poem was to start trying to understand Cuban history, to start understanding where Manzano came from, who his friends are, all sorts of things. So, and that can do nothing but expand you and excite you if it doesn't just completely discourage you with its overwhelming complexity.
So it's not really only two voices in collaboration, but a kind of cacophony or symphony of so many different voices that have glimpses of identity, but don't necessarily have a single source. That's amazing. And I love the idea too that this is an invitation into the poem and its many, many iterations and its many sources. You and I have for long, been devotees of poets who have been poet translators and whose work has influenced, whose translations have influenced their own directions. People like Robert Bly and James Wright, Kenneth Rexroth. Has translating, and you've done a lot of translations from the Spanish, not just Manzano, has translating had that kind of influence on your own poems?
Yeah, I think it has. I think it has because whether you're conscious of it or not, the idea of language itself as a translating tool becomes just one of the gears that start working naturally in your mind. So my own poems, I think, started to pay attention to the process of translating whatever it is, sensory data, emotional content into words, starting to pay attention to that in a new way, as if, in Manzano's poem, all of these things are trees, bloodlines, places, sounds, all these things are voices that end up being, the poem says, record these things with an attentive eye. So I think I naturally started to gravitate toward an idea of writing that was essentially, I know this is not new, but essentially translation and language as this very singular medium that does its best to render a huge web of phenomena and inevitably reduces it even while it sings it. So yeah, I think it has crept into my poetry writing mind inevitably.
Well, Steve, you are not only translating from one language to another, but you've taken the paradigm of translation and brought it to genres. For instance, you've taken many poems and set them to music, sometimes adjusting, altering, augmenting the actual words of the poem, and sometimes keeping all the words. Does that relate to the act of translation in this way you're talking, or is that a different activity altogether?
I don't think it's a different activity altogether, because in moving poems over to songs, you're trying to discover ways in which it depends upon the kind of song that you're producing, of course. So in some ways, many times, for instance, it will amount to introducing regularities into the poem so that they coincide with the regularities of a musical form. I need 4 beats here. The poem's not giving me that. I need to make an adjustment. So it is a matter of taking the original text and finding a rhythm for it that suits this other form. Now, when you're translating, of course, you're not constricted by a musical measure. But I think you are constricted by what you hear in the original text and trying to produce something that that has a musicality corresponding in some way to the original. So when I make a song out of a poem, I'm trying not to distort the poem out of its original being, but to make its singing a different kind of singing. And I think translation is just that. I can't, if I were completely faithful to the poem, I'd just rewrite it in Spanish. I would just reprint it. So I've got to make.
A book, isn't it a perfect translation of Don Quixote? Word for word in Spanish.
Exactly. So yeah, so you have to find a singing that will suit the song you're making, but that certainly has its its ground in the original text.
So interesting. I mean, it feels like, and having witnessed you both in person and on the page and on the stage with these instruments, if you will, the instrument of the voice, the instrument of the various languages happening, and the guitar and your own inimitable voice. I hear many voices, and but one instrument, in a sense, the instrument of allowing these voices to coalesce, blend, reconfigure.
Yeah, I think translation highlights that whole thing that you're describing in a way that, almost nothing else does, especially with a guy like Manzano.
Steve Reese, thanks for joining us on Sign and Breath.
My pleasure. Thank you.